us that affect the land of Israel are the Seleucid dynasty, which is founded in Syria, up by the Phoenicians, and the Ptolemy dynasty, which takes over Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty. If you remember Cleopatra, there's actually a bunch of them, but the Cleopatra that sort of seduces Mark Antony in the time of Julius Caesar is from this line of the Ptolemies in Egypt. The Ptolemies are a strange group of creatures. They're sort of enlightened monarchs, they're called. They're not as warlike, and they like the arts. They also like some other things that are problematic. But the Seleucids and the Ptolemies play into the life of Israel very much. This is the time of the encounter with the Greek world when the wisdom literature is written, Proverbs, the book of wisdom like we heard this morning at Mass. Various pieces of the literature come from this encounter with Greek philosophy that happens. This is a time of the writing of the Septuagint, which is an important Greek translation of the Old Testament. Remember, we've talked before that the largest Jewish community outside of Israel at this time is in Alexandria in Egypt. Around the year 200 to 150, the Maccabean revolt happens. So the Seleucid dynasty that's in Syria, headquartered in Damascus, they have some kings that get big heads. They have one of them who is named Antiochus Epiphanes. He calls himself the son of Zeus. He thinks of himself as a god, and he gets rather grouchy with the Jews. So he eventually sacrifices a pig in the temple and takes its blood and sprays it everywhere. It makes the Jews angry. He says that people have to bow down and worship him. And this is what launches the Maccabean revolt, where the Jews take over the Holy Land. They reject the authority of the Seleucids, and they reestablish rule. Now, from the time of the southern kingdom in 586 until this time of the Maccabean revolt, which seems to take over Jerusalem again around 146. So for 440 years, Israel has been ruled by a foreign power. And there's all kinds of crazy things, like why did people in the time of Jesus expect a Messiah would come? Well, the book of Daniel, which in large part was written in the Babylonian exile, seems to have some of the stuff from the Seleucids and those kind of things. He talks about 70 weeks of years that you will have to be in exile. Well, if you put 490 years and you tack it on the end of 586, you get pretty darn close to the time of Jesus. And so stuff starts to fit together. By the time of about 50 BC, it's Pompey, one of the people in the time of Julius Caesar, that conquers the Holy Land for Rome. And so what has happened is the pieces on the chessboard have shifted. Israel is not a powerful nation. It's often caught between warring peoples in Egypt and further to the east, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks to the north. By the time of 50 BC, the Romans have conquered everything in the Mediterranean world. Outside of the Germanic tribes north of the Danube and the northern part of Great Britain and the Sahara Desert, the Romans rule everything. There are civilizations in India and China at this time, but outside of them, it seems like there's no other major world civilization that's quite like the Romans were. So this is a bit of a historical overview. Do you remember it all? All of the dates and the places? I don't know why. I find it fascinating. But you do have to, one of the challenges that we face is to read the Old Testament well, you have to know some of the pieces of history, especially some of those hallmark dates, the foundation of the temple around 970, the Assyrian exile in 722, the Babylonian exile in 586, the return in 539, the Greek period that happens around the year 300 BC. Because those all have critical significance to the story of the people of Israel. I have another set of blank pages. What on earth did the copier do? So to talk about the temple a little bit, when they're in Egypt, God shows them the pattern of the temple. And this is true also of the tent of meeting. So when they're still moving around, they build this tent that's called the tent of meeting. It eventually gets called the temple when they put it in Shiloh, but it's the tent of meeting, the temple, they all have the same parts. The temple itself, when it's finally built, is bigger and grander. They use better materials in it, but this is its early incarnation. It was revealed to Moses by God, who shows him how it's supposed to look. It is the center of Jewish life. One of the great puzzles is what on earth people did at this time in history in daily life. Because the synagogue and that movement in Jewish life, the Pharisees and the holiness movement, that only comes about in the time of the Babylonian exile. So about 550 BC. We're still, 500 some odd years before that at this point in time. So there's no synagogues. It's like, well, what did they do? How did they worship God? What was their connection to the temple? And trying to find life in Iron Age ancient Israel is a challenge. Some of you, if you want to be a Google sleuth or look up on an internet search engine, see if you can dig out life in Iron Age Israel. Because we're going to talk about that. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age happens at the time of the invasion of Israel and them leaving the land of Egypt, give or take. We'll get there. But we have to talk about the temple first. So this is a building, it's a place where they encounter the living presence of God, where God dwells. He is said to be enthroned on the wings of the cherubim. The image is used at the Ark of the Covenant, which was this gold box. It was made out of acacia wood and layered in gold that they build after the time of the Exodus. That gold box was where they put the tablets of the Ten Commandments, the 2 tablets of stone. The second set of tablets, because Moses breaks the first ones. God is like, you shouldn't have done that. He got angry and conflustrated and threw them. And the Lord said, I need to make new ones now. You sit on timeout. But they kept them in the ark. The ark on the lid has 2 angels with wings that are extended out and they meet. The place where the wings meet is called the mercy seat. The 2 angels are called cherubim. And so God enthroned on the wings of the cherubim will encounter in some of the Psalms. It means like God in his presence on the top of the Ark of the Covenant. That this was the physical dwelling place of God on earth, at least at this time. Later, when they build the temple, they make giant cherubim. And they have like giant throne room guardian things over the Ark of the Covenant. I think that are something like, by the time of the temple building, are they 30 feet tall? But the ones on the top of the ark is like 3 feet, I think, or 3 cubits. Maybe it's 4.5 feet, something like that. Close enough. In the early life of David, the Ark of the Covenant is kept in the temple at Shiloh. That's where Samuel encounters the ark, where Samuel meets the high priest, and the high priest had become corrupt. That's the end of the time of Judges. So they have this tent of meeting, they have this early temple, they all kind of look the same. David makes plans to bring the ark from Shiloh to Jerusalem. It ends up, this plague happens after he does a census. He wasn't supposed to do that. And the angel stops when he's on the threshing floor of Arunah. And that's where they build the temple after David buys it. So the parts of this temple, or the parts of the tent of meeting, they're the same, and it's basically the same pattern and design. I think I put a picture of it in here so you can see some of it. It's easier. You can find lots of pictures of the tent of meeting and the temple or the ark. All of these things you can find pictures of. They're pretty easy. So there is an area to the front of it. So the temple is situated, if you're thinking of a plan, or what do you call these things? There's a name for it. A site map? That's not it. Whatever. We'll ask Tim. He should know. It's some architecture term. There's this thing that means, like, when you're looking at it from above and you see the parts of it. Whatever that term is. Yeah, I feel like there's some more technical word, but we'll go with it. So if you're looking at it that way, the temple is on the left, it's on the west side. On the east side is a courtyard, because the doors of the temple face the east. So there is a courtyard. This is an area in front of the entrance. It's divided by a curtain at this time. Later it's divided by the front of the temple. But at this time it's divided by a curtain from the temple proper. This is an open area where the animals are killed. Temple worship is a mess. It's bloody. It involves the death of animals and feathers and fur and bones and charcoal and all those sorts of things. None of it is clean. This is where the Levites come in. The Levites are the grunt workers of the temple and the tent of meeting. They're in charge of cleaning off ashes, of moving charcoal, of taking animal fur and bones and all of those sorts of things and moving them around. The priests wore aprons and different sorts of garments because they were always killing things. In the courtyard of the temple are a couple of other things. One of them is the altar of burnt offerings. This is a tall altar where there was a fire kindled on the top, and they offered various animals. There's fire and smoke. It becomes an image of Mount Sinai. You have a tall thing with fire on the top. That's how Mount Sinai is described in the time of the Exodus and the places where they offer sacrifices. They also have a basin full of water in the courtyard. This is called the laver. Later it's called the sea. Solomon builds a giant one, and then he builds lots of little ones that they can push around. But you have a giant thing of water because it's always a mess. It's always dirty. You need lots of water to clean off the blood.
I'm sorry, but I can't imagine anybody going to worship. The smell had to be...
It would be something, but there's a couple of things. First one is that in the ancient world, there's far more smells, and they think that your sense of smell just got deadened after a while, because most people live with animals. Like, you have cattle or sheep in your basement. You know, human excrement and human waste is common. You have to figure that out in cities. There's always something rotting and fermenting. The temple, the two things in the temple would be that it would smell like incense because they burned a lot of it, and it would smell like roasting meat because they were often cooking meat, which were probably more pleasant smells than lots of the other ones. But there are puzzles. They actually do wonder if our sense of smell has grown far more acute in recent generations because we no longer are assaulted by so many biological smells all the time. But the ancient world was a smelly place, and people sweat, and the Jews they liked to be cleaner than other races because they had various water rituals and cleansing things, but people smelled all the time. Like, smelling was not something unusual. There were always smells. So yeah, there's parts of it where it's just like, Lord, thank you for the modern world. Where rotten food isn't something that you deal with on a daily basis. It's like, oh, we forgot it in our refrigerator for a while. There's no refrigeration, so rotten food is a fact of life. So I just find it hard to imagine. I feel like thinking about it too much is traumatic, so I kind of don't. Because, think of the number of smells that you would have. You don't have any major cleaners, so if someone throws up in your house, what do? You can cover it with dirt, but there's times where it's just like you got to get that smell out, and you want vinegar and bleach or flamethrowers or, It's not a great smell. And, the ancient world, there's no understanding of things like bacteria and how. So, yes, we're going to talk about, we have to get to Iron Age world in our minds, and that's kind of exciting. It's worth doing some research on. But in all likelihood, the major smells around the temple would be of things like bread cooking, because there were grain offerings, and roasting meat and incense, which I would argue that's actually a decent combination of smells. Probably better than the cow pens, or the pigs or sheep or whatever else. So there's a courtyard, there's a big altar, and then there's a water thing. The water thing would be reminiscent of the Red Sea, crossing the water to the land of Israel. The tent itself uses 4 layers of cloth. The thing was heavy. This is one of the other things, is we think that there must have been a way of cleaning these things, because it only talks about them making one set. But if you had a set of curtains hanging anywhere, it would not take long for them to be covered in mud. And it would not take long for them to be covered in dust, and for them to smell like every kind of thing under the sun, and probably be crawling with bugs. So it seems like they must have had other sets that they changed in and out, because they took great care of the temple. This was the place, the dwelling place of the living God. And you can see that that's actually a lot of care to keep up a building like that, to keep up curtains and all kinds of different things that are huge. That's plenty of work for even several hundred people. It's 45 feet long, 15 feet tall, and 15 feet wide. The Holy of Holies, where the ark is kept, is a perfect cube. And then the other spot, the holy place, is 2 cubes that are set next to each other. So it's a rectangle, but they liked the cubic kind of motif. Inside, they seem to have decorated it with things like pineapples and pomegranates and cherubim. They're very careful about portraying any fashion of the Lord, of God himself, because of the problem of idolatry. But they do seem to be fond of decorating it with different things that make it look somewhat like a garden. The holy place is in the front, and then the most holy place is in the back part, that cubic part. In the front, on the north side, so on the top, if you're thinking of the site plan, east and west, like we usually do, the top of it is the table of the bread of the presence. They make this bread and they leave it there for a week at a time. It's called the showbread. This is reminiscent of the manna in the desert. And then on the south side of the interior place, they have a menorah. The menorah of the temple have 7 branches. 8 come from Hanukkah and the 8 days that the oil lasted at this temple celebration, I think in the book of Maccabees. But temple menorah have 7 branches, 1 in the middle and then 3 pairs, which is a symbolic representation of a burning bush. It's also 7 days, but you have this thing with branches and fire on the end. so it makes it look like a burning bush. You can start to see where this is going. It's all about remembering Sinai. In the middle of the temple, in this front place, you have the altar of incense. This is a small altar that's placed in front of the inner curtain, and on top of it, there were charcoal, and they burned incense several times a day. The most holy place is on the back end, the far left, if you're thinking of that site plan. That is where the Ark of the Covenant is kept. You can see on this one, there is a kind of wooden structure underneath all of the curtains. But there's several layers of curtains, and there's all these implements. You have to fill the menorah with oil. The inside of it is hollow, and we think they had wicks that stretched down into the interior part so that it would always be drawing up oil and it would stay lit. That it was some kind of oil candle. And then there's showbread to make, there's altars to clean, there's blood to clean up, there's a lot of cleaning involved, which means that it's a significant thing for people and for water. You also have to have a large herd of animals because there's sacrifices that need to be offered twice a day, plus lots of extra ones. And then there's even more sacrifices at various times of the year. Most of them you can use sheep and goats for, and some of them have to be bulls. Bulls would be far more valuable and far larger, require far more work. But it means that the temple or the tent of meeting has to have a relatively large flock of animals that are cared for and reared constantly because you have all of these sacrifices to do every day of the year. It's not clear how often people go to the temple to pray at this point. That's one of the puzzles that I would like to sort through is spiritual life in Iron Age Israel. Again, that's a challenge to find. Oh boy, let's see. Any questions about the temple that I can do my best to answer? This is a good thing. Like I said, you can find lots of pictures of it. What I think we'll do now is flip to the very back page, page 18. This is a map or a chart, if you will, of the Levitical sacrifices that are offered or have to be offered or can be offered. So the first one is a burnt offering, a whole burnt offering. This is where the whole thing is burned on the altar. I believe the offerings twice a day are burnt offerings. I should have looked that up. There's 2 sacrifices a day, a morning sacrifice and an evening sacrifice that the whole people or the leadership of the people are asked to provide. And then outside of those 2, which are the required ones for the whole people, individuals can offer their own for various different laws that they break or different things that they do. So the whole burnt offering is a gift to make atonement for sins, or for a prayer of praise. But most of them are sin offerings, and these would be a big deal. The forgiveness of sins was directly tied to making offerings in the temple at this time. So if you wanted to be forgiven by God, you had to offer these things in the temple. Grain offerings were possible. These you would mix flour, sometimes flour and oil with it, sometimes incense, and then burn it on one of the altars. Grain offerings are more voluntary. Some of them, if you're poor, sometimes you can substitute grain for animals. If animals would be too expensive, you can substitute grain. If you remember, Mary and Joseph in the temple offer 2 turtle doves, after the birth of Jesus. That was one of the purification things after childbirth. And turtle doves were cheaper than a lamb, which was the usual sacrifice there, which is part of the reason why we think that Joseph and Mary were likely on the poorer end of things. Although it's very possible Joseph, being something like a stonesmason or a craftsman, probably worked with wood some too, that the career would allow them to be well enough off for the people at the time, but it's likely that part of their poverty was because of their generosity, that they shared so much of what they had with people around them. But nonetheless, sometimes there's like a sacrifice that's required, but if you don't have the money to make it, then there's like steps of different things that you can do. The fellowship or the peace offering is important because in this one, you share some of the sacrificial offering with the Lord, but then the people and the priests eat together. It was a covenant meal with God. And even the rabbis talk about how the peace offering is the only one that will remain in the new covenant. The other name for it is a thank offering, or the Todah sacrifice, which would be the Jewish form of the word Eucharist, which means thanksgiving. So the New Testament seems to pick up on that same language and talks about Jesus in various sacrificial overtones, but that the one sacrifice that would remain is a peace offering or a fellowship or of communion. And those are all words that are used to describe the Mass by the early Christians. And so it's like, yes, we have the new covenant, we have our peace offering with the Lord, we have a covenant in his blood, and so we continue to celebrate or eat or offer the sacrifice of this peace offering. The sin offering is a different sort of offering, but it's related to the burnt offering, and then a reparation or a guilt offering. You can look at other tables of the sacrifices from Leviticus. They spell this out in greater detail, but I just wanted to show you a different sense. Like, this is a lot of animals. You're talking about a massive amount of stuff, even if the group of people isn't all that large. There seems to be some evidence that people could also go in together. Like if there were 10 people coming to the tent of meeting and they had to offer one of these burnt offerings or a guilt offering, that your offering might be like a tenth of a share. You would buy an animal or you would bring one from your flock, but that people would share things together. Because otherwise, you're just talking about thousands of animals that have to be offered all the time. And if you think about that in the economic sense of what it would mean, that's a ton of food production that's being lost constantly that's dedicated to the Lord. And that's a big deal in a society that isn't all that stable, that doesn't have the same kind of protections in place for people. To constantly be losing that much food production is a recipe for famine. And there were famines in the ancient world, but the children of Israel were not always under times of famine. And so part of it, this is part that you have to sort of crunch and work with, is that the way that the Bible lays it out isn't always as clear as it seems at first. Because if even if all of us in this room made every offering that was required for various sins, we'd need what? A flock of 10,000 animals? Because even if you have only one that you have to offer each day, if you manage to only sin once a day and had to offer an animal once a day for each of us, think about that. And you need that every day of the year, plus all of the extra ones for the morning sacrifice and the evening sacrifice. Like, you'd just either be talking about an absolutely insane number of creatures, or some part of this is not quite the way it appears to us. The same thing happens with some of the laws. There's some suspicion for instance, that if you killed everyone that committed various sins, you wouldn't have very many people left after very long. And so there is a possibility that sometimes it spells out more of a maximum penalty than a penalty that was used all the time everywhere. Because just from the sociological standpoint, it's hard to fathom killing that many people all the time. You just don't have that many people around. Communities aren't that large. So there are puzzles like that, like I said, and it's not clear. It's not that I'm trying to say we should doubt the biblical text. It's just that understanding how the biblical text works in situations and in history, you have to apply a lot of logic and reasoning. I mean, even when I was trying to think about careers in Iron Age Israel, what kind of careers do you think, or occupations, what did people do? What do you think they needed lots of? Most of the people would be connected to agriculture and food production. That is true. What else do you need a lot of? Tent makers and clothing and weavers and like all of this stuff. If you're killing that many animals, you constantly need new aprons. Right? Like there would be a ton of job security if you made clothing at that point. You also need lots of pots. Like being a potter would be hard work, but you use pots for practically everything, and you need a lot of them because they also have this habit of breaking. I mean, sometimes I think about stuff like, at home we have an old set of dishes that are from I think my mom's great-grandma. So they're 100 and some years old now, I think. And they're a bit of a family heirloom. But you almost can't use them very often because if you use them, they break. Sometimes I look at old water glasses, and water glasses are like the worst. And I come back home after being away for a while, and it's like, I don't remember those glasses being there before. Like, what happened to the other ones? Oh, they all broke. And in ancient cities, like they had giant piles of broken pots. They had a pile of broken pots outside of ancient Jerusalem. It ends up being called the place that Gehenna comes from is this place where there were lots of burning fires from organic material and potsherds, which are these pot pieces that break. Because once they've been fired, they didn't know in the ancient world how to reuse them. Once it's broken, I think now they've figured out you can grind it down to a powder and mix it with some other things and use it again. But back then they didn't, and so they just had giant piles of broken pots. And when it broke, you'd take your stuff to the giant pile of broken pots and leave it there. And those could be very, very sharp. But it's just like when we imagine this biblical world, most of the people are involved in food production and then lots of these ancillary things that are needed to provide for the temple. People would be involved in those. We'll talk more about occupations and people next time and try and dig into a little bit of life in